foundation of our house was built on an anthem. The anthem was a prayer our hearts rendered in the language of silence. The rooms reflect our hearts with no light, no warmth. The floors balance the stones our souls carry. Flowers withered by bitter breath. Cold crawls over us and nibbles at our seams. We never knew lack until poverty found residency in our mouths. Despondency has been rattling the door's hinges. Notwithstanding that, tonight we're hosting a dinner to find out how we got here, how we have come to this house come ICU to further life or to end it. Who bribed us into deserting our lifeline? We asked all and sundry to come dine with us, a night that stretched for 26 years. We served organic suggestions that night, topped with rhetorical questions. These guests are not here to eat the plight of our life's stories, to hear how we are not living to go to heaven, but to not look at every meal as though it's the Last Supper. We all keep glancing at equality with faint smiles, trying to ignore how we became victimized by the spoils of a struggle. No one often reminds the once oppressed how tyrannical giants fall. So when fortune favors them, greed has them inflating, bursting beyond their bellies. Illusions of democracy attempt to open my mouth, but reality has this tongue feeling like a severed limb. There are gaps in this conversation of intellectual liberation that have our voices shifting as tectonic plates. Until Father Time uttered his only words that evening, my people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. Abruptly, labor shouted to capitalism. This forged, long-run romance between us and progress is no longer glue that keeps this house together. You have redefined moral hazards, dealt a hand to hedge everything but the people. With a smug, capitalism retorted, "Don't feed on what you can't fund." The futurist put on his contact lens to comment. This house is on fire. All present are flooding it with emptiness, drenching every space with blood clots to save its foundation. Tip the scales. Sorrow has assaulted your lungs for far too long. Deflate into a readiness to flow. Teach the mind so the heart may preserve its lessons. Our minds are gifts. Earth acknowledges our presence. And so the next day, we spring cleaned, dusted off distrust, washed the years of betrayal off the walls, washed inequality off our skin, watched injustice flow out the baths, and see it drain stagnation's throat. To hear our own esophagus emphasize the echo of victories our stomachs are yet to clasp. Soak ourselves in knowledge from Urban Festival 2020, embracing our best ideals which await in plenty. We will refurnish every room with a lived experience, embedded in the sight of memory, not yet sung of us.
Good morning, everybody out there. It's a real pleasure to welcome you on behalf of Platform 100, and also to extend my gratitude to South Africa Cities Network for facilitating this amazing platform and discussion around urbanization and the issues which are of great concern to us and future generations. What an incredible way to start the session. I found the poem both inspiring, the use of language in terms of conversations, voices, eliciting a whole range of ideas and concerns around how we can connect better to ourselves and better to the planet. And this is absolutely appropriate because it ties very much into the spirit of what Platform 100 is about. Today, we're looking at the topic or theme of empowering the civic through design. Three very, very important words are captured in that statement. One is the question of empowerment. The other one is the question of civic. The other one is the question of design. These three words allow us to unlock an intersection between livelihoods, design, and policy in order for us to imagine a different world. But where do we sit right now in terms of a different world, a different continent, and the cities in which we reside? The United Nations Global Status Report tells us that buildings account for 35% of current energy use and contribute to 40% of carbon emissions. And that's just one of a whole host of stats which we need to think about when it comes to cities and urbanization. By 2030, 1.68 billion people will call the continent their home, and 65% of the population shall be younger than 25. This has huge implications for how we imagine cities from the perspective of entrepreneurship, planning, design, policy interventions, how do we engage with divided cities, and the question of digital connectivity, amongst a few. It's my absolute pleasure to welcome you today and to also hand over to the chairperson of Platform 100, who will give you a bit of an insight in terms of the history and the origination behind Platform 100, after which I will then introduce the panelists and we will have a robust and free-flowing discussion where we will engage with these issues, and it will be one of a series of conversations that we will have with you, decision makers, and other ecosystem actors with regards to the urban environment. For those of you who can and are on your various social media devices, please use hashtag Platform100 in your various platforms. We encourage you to send us questions via the chat group, and I look forward to having a wonderful session with you all today. Amira Osman, I hand over to you.
Thank you so much, Mokena. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for everyone that's here. The audience, which we currently can't see, welcome. Welcome to the launch of Platform 100. I am honored to have this launch as part of the South African Urban Festival. So thank you, South African Cities Network and all your partners. A special thank you to Geshe and Jeffrey for this opportunity. And a very special thanks to the whole South African Cities Network organizing team. I also want to thank Dalberg. Thank you for being our first partner. I think you've given us the confidence to move forward very boldly with this project. Thank you to the panelists, to each and every one of you. You are highly valued in this process. And the bios for the audience will be in the chat and on the social media platforms of Platform 100, which are also being shared on the chat. Thank you to my institution and numerous people I have invited today because they played a major role. I think they will know why they were invited. They played a major role to getting us to this stage. So if you've been invited as a member of the audience, we thank you for making the time to join us, and we will be reaching out for more conversations in the near future. Our launch is intended as the first in a series of conversations aiming towards the establishment of multi-year collaborations and partnerships. We do have a team working behind the scenes, and we will collect your comments and questions, and we will engage with you after the session. Unfortunately, the session format and limited time will not allow us to have a live engagement. The most exciting thing about my new position as SACHI Chair in Spatial Transformation is that it allows me to deliberately, systematically, and in a targeted manner, bring more diverse voices to join the dialogue around transformation in the built environment. I would like to acknowledge Mokena Mokeka and thank him in this whole process. We have worked together. Our journey began together when we were planning for UIA 2014 in Durban. We worked with Hilton Judin and Mpeti Marajela as a core team of the scientific committee. Our theme was Otherwhere. We conceptualized the event to be able to hear other voices and explore other places. I see Platform 100 as a legacy of UIA 2014 Durban. SIA, we will be reaching out. That's the South African Institute for Architects. While we made incredible progress in 2014 to establish a new agenda for architecture, the built environment disciplines in general, and all other disciplines with which we need to partner towards the achievement of transformation, I also think we've regressed somewhat since then. We continue to celebrate celebrity and beautiful object buildings. We continue to look towards Europe for inspiration. Indeed, we have been told that we are 20 years behind Europe and we need to catch up. We continue to value celebrity architects who have made sites of poverty and informality their new their new playgrounds, in the process sidelining the role of local people who better understand the context. We continue to tell architects and designers that delve into the messiness and complexities of the everyday, crossing between strict disciplinary boundaries, that this is not real architecture. It's too political, it's too controversial, it's lacking in creativity and talent. Implying, of course, that creativity and talent are held by an individual working in isolation and represented in an object building. This is, after all, what our constitutions and regulatory bodies continue to regulate, value, and award. We also continue to undermine the role of design and designers in the development of cities. Someone once said the apartheid city was conceived by the greatest architectural minds at the time. I therefore believe that we need the greatest architectural minds to undo the spatial legacy of apartheid and envision a new future. Yet despite the importance of design and the importance of the architectural profession in achieving transformation, these professions continue to be excluded. Perceived to delay projects, another person said, architects are an interesting bunch of people, very reflective. I don't have time for them. Yet despite the negative perceptions about the profession, we can't blame others for our exclusion when our own institutions and regulatory bodies remain untransformed. So what is Platform 100? Platform 100 aims to do many things, but I will mention 3 critical objectives. We need to change the conversation around city space and transformation. We need to center design, reinforcing the importance of the role of the design professionals, and we need to establish partnerships towards the implementation of innovation in the built environment. Yes, we ultimately want to experiment and implement and build on real sites with real partners in collaboration with real communities in South Africa and across Africa. The power of design may only be harnessed through advanced thinking and practice. And this is what will help us achieve real felt transformation in citizen space. So Platform 100 is conceived under the auspices of the Saatchi Chair for Spatial Transformation with the tagline, Positive Change in the Built Environment. A few weeks ago, I asked, what does transformation look like and how do we design transformation? How do we create livable and lovable cities? Livable in the sense of being equitable, beautiful, functional, diverse, and responding to culture and climate. Lovable by resonating with many, embracing all, and allowing for choice and change while being embedded in context. How do we provide environments that cater for both the formal and the informal? Environments that embrace complexity, the unknown and the unexpected. At that time, I proposed a system, and I continue to do so, a system that is inherently participative. And I do not mean the sit around the table and talk type of participation without undermining that. I proposed a system that self-regulates and allows us to design for unknown futures and unknown clients, or for clients with dynamic and constantly changing needs. I proposed structures that are beautiful, robust, and long-lasting, emerging from and belonging to context. I used a borrowed metaphor and compared these structures to indigenous trees. Their scale and interface with the public realm is highly inclusive and is related to a finer grain of existing urban fabric, implying a relationship with the streets that encourages different levels of commercial activity with a density that allows for small businesses to flourish. The architectural character, massing, materiality is innovative and varies from place to place. These structures are at once ordinary and unique, resourceful and creative, imaginative yet practical. These structures and roads and public spaces that support them are an expression of the collective aspirations of particular communities. Within them, we find space for personal expression and personal aspirations. Similar to vernacular contexts, architecture and planning are merged. They are no longer distinct disciplines. Buildings merge and disappear in the collective, and the streets and public space take precedence over individual buildings. The streets and the public space sometimes also defer to the buildings in a manner that is evident in old Medinas and medieval city centers. This environment is premised on evolution, inclusion, collaboration, and learning, And as the environment evolves, the society that hosts it evolves. Everyone is a decision maker at some level. And I will hand over to Mokena Mokeka and the panel to continue the conversation.
Thank you so much, Amira. Listening to you reminds me of why I'm so excited about Platform 100. Going right back to our early discussions, which actually go back to 2012, if you recall. That's when the scientific committee was actually first assembled in preparation for 2014. So to be here now, 6 years later, engaged with these ideas, but also seized by the urgency that comes through your words, is something that I'm very proud to be a part of. I noticed that we have 63 participants. Thank you so much to everybody for joining with us. Let me start by saying that this medium of Zoom is something that we all struggle and grapple with. Ideally, we would have been talking to each other face to face, but we make do with the circumstances that are around us. It is part of the contingency of design and what we have to endure in order to survive. Likewise, I will not be able to give a proper description of this amazing panel. Please take the time to engage with their profiles, their bios, Google them, but I will give literally 90 or so seconds just describing them, and then we'll get into a discussion. All of these panelists, these esteemed panelists, are here not just because of their achievements, either in professional or academic terms, but also because of their humanity and concern for the built and the natural environment. So in no particular order, I just wanted to welcome them and then allow them to perhaps give a little bit of a synopsis, 2 minutes on their own, describing what is their intersection with Platform 100 and what keeps them interested with regards to the cities of today. James Mwangi, good friend, executive director of Dalberg, a firm that is doing substantial impact across the continent in a number of sectors. Welcome. Professor Mabel Wilson, friend, teacher, an amazing scholar, coming in all the way from New York. So much respect to you. We understand that you're 6 hours away from us. So thank you for making the time this morning. Dao Tavengwa, an amazing scholar, curator, an incredible work in publishing. Also known you for at least 10 years, if I can recall. Thank you so much for making the time, my friend. And Nthato Minyuku, ex-classmate and a stellar expert in terms of strategic infrastructure development, participation, as well as urban development issues in general. Thank you so much, Nthato, for being here. Charles Nduku, you sit really at that interface between professional practice and engaging with government, and in particular, moving that needle in terms of getting real conversations around the profession. Thank you so much. Makhta Mustafa, old friend from Cairo, a fellow urbanist. You continue to amaze me with all of the work that you do, and I hope you'll be able to share some of those ideas today. Kieran Mackel, we met fairly recently, but your story is absolutely amazing. I think your concern about divided cities and connectivity is absolutely remarkable. And last but not least, Prof. Mpofu, the incredible work that you're doing with regards to transport-oriented development, infrastructure, movement, mobility. All of you are having an incredible impact in terms of how we're beginning to reimagine cities and reimagining our participation with cities. So understanding that I've probably exhausted my allocation for that time, the way that I would like to structure the next session, colleagues, is if we imagine that we're holding a ball in our hands and we're sitting in a circle. So I'm going to toss the ball to one of the panelists. Please take 2 minutes to give us some thoughts, some reflections. You have all received some provocations, and then really pass the ball to the next person. I would like to keep it fairly fluid, fairly open-ended, and having a sort of good and robust, but dynamic conversation. So I would like to pass the ball to Nthato. Do you mind catching the ball and speaking for 2 minutes?
Will do. Thanks, Mokena, and thanks so much for inviting me to the platform. I'd like to say hi to everybody on the line as well. I mean, I think there's so many themes at play in this conversation around design, civic culture, and empowerment. But so some of the issues and the considerations that really preoccupy me is public space and the interface between public space and digitization in a context of social experimentation, and understanding that digitization has accelerated people, especially urban youth's awareness of how to occupy space by consuming the images that resonate with their identities from across the world. Because of course, observation is the first form of instruction. So whether this is through the collective protest and resistance aimed at bringing about political change and economic regime, from the Arab Spring to Fees Must Fall to the Yellow Vests and even End SARS now that we see in Nigeria, it's also about how digital access and digitization has brought about solidarity and hope, as exemplified in the worldwide viral phenomenon of the Jerusalem Dance Challenge. And so how then does the digital platform and digitization interface with placemaking and design and urban development in order to mitigate, if I can say, some of the competing forces between economics, commerciality, and of course, the public good? And I'm saying the public good because what is the public? And so for me, my primary concern, and I think the interface I'm going to be having is really understanding how the digital age helps us understand the interdependency between design, civic culture, and empowerment, and the role of the digital divide in either reinforcing existing fault lines, as we've seen through COVID, or creating new opportunities to create new civic cultures, to create new identities, to influence outcomes, as well as thinking about urban space and urban futures. And then I'll just finalize to say that it's interesting that this conversation was started about the role of designers. And I'm interested to understand which designers, because so many designers are now influencing urban futures and how we think collectively about the potential for the future of African cities and cities. From the film industry with Black Panther to auto manufacturers like Nissan, who've already come out with a concept with Fosters and Partners about how the street is going to become the fuel station of the future. And so, in my view, especially coming out of the planning profession, where I think we came to the understanding that it's important to create platforms for multidisciplinary engagement and engagement across different sectors in order to really create spaces for innovation and creativity where there can be that cross pollination of thinking and practice. Understanding that ultimately the how the city is made, it does boil down to a large degree to the economics, the commerciality, and of course, the political economy. I'll leave it there. I'm not sure if I should hand the baton to someone else or hand it to you and then you'll hand it to someone else.
No, pass it to somebody in the group so it becomes more organic. Just anybody else in the group. Yeah.
Okay, sure. I will pass it to Kieran.
Thank you, Natara. Thank you. Thanks a lot. Well, I suppose I would like to maybe talk about a number of things. I'm interested in fragments, and I'm interested in the ideas of confluence, that there are streams of influence that impact us all of the time, and that out of those, we generally build a richer way of practice and a richer way of engagement. And the two things, I suppose, that have influenced me at a huge level probably has been that I started university in the middle of the 1970s in Belfast, in a period of conflict, urban warfare. And I left college in the year of the 1981 hunger strikes, in which 10 people died. And that period still is impactful, and it still remains the lens through which many people see or understand political agency. And out of all that period, two things have impacted my own practice work, and in some level, some of my academic work as well. And that really is about the need to build empowerment, to enrich people, and to find a way to help them build capacity so they can actually influence and react to policies and proposals that impact their lives and their cities. And that work doesn't really go on very well, actually. It's generally assumed by government and assumed by administrations that people have the capacity themselves to respond to certain things, and they don't. But what I do think is important is that, although that's an important role, I think, for an architect, that the architect should be an active agent in society. We should challenge the forces. We should be part of the forces of change. We're not just form givers. We need to do that way to help people understand their own place and help them respond positively. But we also need means to find a way to engage with government and engage with government at all the levels of government, that is both the local administration and at what may become regional or national governments that impact on policies, because it's those policies that actually frame how our work will be perceived in the years ahead.
Fantastic, fantastic contribution. Yep. Who do you pick?
Well, Magda's on my screen, so Magda.
Magda, the floor
Thank
is
you.
yours. Yeah.
Thank you, Kieran. I just give a little prayer that the internet holds until I can say my 2 minutes. So it's lovely to see old friends and new friends here. And my interest in the topic that we're talking about today really comes from my interest in the margins and in the vulnerabilities on different scales, vulnerabilities and margins of the disenfranchised, but in a way that isn't in isolation and hyper-specialized, but in a way that is more intersectional, both across those margins, but also to inform the center. And the two areas that I come at this appreciation of the value of learning from the margins is first my work on informality and the challenge of this formal-informal divide. And I think it's so important to have this conversation across our continent and across our part of the world, because that, as Amira said, is where the knowledge really comes from. And the second binary that I challenge is the normative, non-normative binary across the realm of special needs, particularly in the sensory environment, neurodiversity, and autism. So that's the second binary that I come at from the margins. And this lens spans three parts of my work: my research, my teaching, and my practice. From the teaching perspective, I like to bring an agenda to my classroom, into the studios that I teach, to encourage students to think in a way that breaks down these binaries, but also that looks at the juxtapositions of space, and to think of cities as a truly intersectional experience, and that to understand that the depth of their understanding of engaging with design is only as deep as their understanding of the layers that they're engaging within. So whether those are layers of users and mobility and history and politics and economy, I mean, I think that list is never too exhaustive. And we developed something that I call the Juxtapolis pedagogy. It's an honor, of course, to be sharing the screen with Professor Mabel Wilson. And the reason I bring it up is because this Juxtapolis pedagogy was something I developed with GSAP and colleagues there when we were investigating the Arab city in 2014. And my research and design philosophy at a much smaller scale looks at something that I pose, which is spectrum thinking. This idea of addressing problems across a spectrum. Again, dismantling these binaries of us and them, formal, informal, normal, quote, abnormal. This idea of challenging them and really finding solutions through that lens of spectrum thinking. And I just want to wrap my 2 minutes with two kind of ethical positions that emerged from that work. The first is that I really believe that good design is a basic human right. I work with the International Union of Architects, as Amira and Mokena indicated in their wonderful 2014. And I just have to say that was a turning point, in my opinion, at least in UIA ethos, the concept of otherware and bringing it to South Africa. But I really believe that good design is a basic human right. And that good design can't be informed by just looking at central normative thinking, that a reverse inclusive stance needs to be taken. We need to look at the margins to inform the center, and that we need to challenge that normative Western white, and that those lessons from the margins actually make our central, more mainstream design more powerful. And finally, I'm very much committed to ensuring agency of bodies in space, and that when we design from the most vulnerable lens, we benefit all, and we elevate the right to the city, the right to urban space, the right to inclusion to a level that is both intersectional and universal, and really can help move our conversation around cities and spaces forward. And so since I mentioned her. Maybe I'll pass it on to Professor Mabel Wilson.
Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you, Magda. I also just want to say thank you, Professor Osmond, Mr. McKenna, and my esteemed colleagues for inviting me to share my perspectives. And hi to all of those who've joined this really lively discussion. And I really work in architectural design, but also at the intersection of history. And so I'm not only interested in where we're going, but also how did we get here? And so I wanted to think about the modern subject as one that is a political one. She is a citizen, which I think is a category that has to be capacious enough to think about the rights of the non-citizen. And I think the space in which she acts is a civic space, or the space of the polis, that is public space. And it is a shared realm of engagement, negotiation, but more importantly, contestation. I think as Platform 100 asked us, how can we frame the civic differently? Can what we call civic space be made and designed differently? So in order to do that, I think we have to recognize that the West's reinvention of the idea of the citizen, civic, and public may not be malleable enough in its meaning to accommodate everyone and their everyday experiences, whether they reside in the global South or where I am in Africa's diaspora. I would say it can be said that the geographic designations themselves of global South and global North articulate hemispheric differences that reflect the legacies of European colonization. It echoes the dialectic binaries of North, South, First World, Third World, developed, underdeveloped, whiteness, Blackness, Europe, and Europe's others. These primal representations of difference enable domination and the exploitation and theft of land, a 400-year-long project of racial capitalism that has in fact rendered the planet on the threshold of catastrophe. These broad brush representations of difference, however, articulate power relations that do not necessarily reflect what was, and more importantly, what is happening on the ground in cities around the world. As we in the US are fighting for basic human rights like healthcare, housing, along with our civil rights like the right to have my vote count, could it be that the Enlightenment project was never meant to be inclusive of political subjects, particularly those racialized as Black and brown? Democracy in the West was in fact a project of liberation built on the destruction of our freedom, cultures, and histories. The killing of George Floyd in the US, who stands in for all the men, women, and children murdered by the police and white vigilantes while simply walking or jogging down the street, standing on the sidewalk, playing in the park, or driving a car, demonstrates that there is literally no space in public space where Blackness has freedom, certainly here in the US. So what forms of human relations are possible? What new spaces of collective life are emerging? Ones that make life outside of violence enacted by capitalism and the state. Can we imagine a shared realm that is liberated, but more importantly, livable by everyone? So that's what I'd like to add to our conversation today. And I am going to pass it on to Tao.
Thanks, Mabel. Thank you, Amira and McKenna, and congrats on launching this. So where I come in is for the last decade or so, we've been publishing this small publication that has really been trying to get into this issue of really trying to understand or at least on some level take a scan of what is happening in particularly across the African continent, in various parts of Asia, and in Latin America, in as far as how the professions are contributing and affecting how we perceive and what is happening to our built environments. And that's been interesting because constantly I'm sort of stuck between practitioners, civic type people, and academics on the other end. And the thing that I've noticed the most in this work is how each profession insists of being at the center of whatever the problem is. And on one level, it's an expression of, I suppose, passion, and a set of passions towards one thing, and a commitment to trying to at least not solve, but address a particular problem. But it also creates a dissonance that ultimately does not help or move things forward. So my interest has been trying to facilitate and kind of, on some level, scrub away and clarify some of that dissonance. And also to, I suppose, on some level, disabuse designers particularly, of which I am one, of this idea that we can solve all problems. I don't think design at its purest is about being in the center of something. I think actually, as I think we would all agree that good design disappears in the background. So once design is put in the center of something, I think already it's a violation of like the potential it has, which is to solve or contribute towards how we perceive and understand certain problems and disappear. And I think design also has a duty, and designers are skilled enough to be really great facilitators. So the question for me is, how do we identify as strongly and passionately as we do as designers, as communicators, etc., but also how do we see ourselves in other professions and find ways of dealing with other professions that do not insist that we are at the center. This could be said about multiple other professionals. I think it's just the nature of these definitions. My hope with Platform 100 is that it sort of enables on some level this, let's call it this alchemic clash of ideas beyond and out of like the borders that the professions impose, but also ultimately that it really sort of perhaps centers this question of sticking to design. Who are these professions? Who are designers at the service of? Who are our real true clients? And I think redefining and finding a way to like really rethink and articulate that might go a long way in figuring out how we work. I also want to add that I'm particularly interested in this idea of how the work and ideas on how to address certain issues travels across borders, across languages, and how we ought to all insist on learning from the most unlikely places. I personally think we as people that work broadly in the built environment have got far more to learn out of your Indias, out of your Brazils, out of your Colombias, out of your Lagoses than we do. And I'm talking here as somebody from Southern Africa that, so I think we really need to kind of like also redraw that map. And I'm hoping, and I'm very excited by the possibility of working with you guys in future as you start on this like epic journey. And congrats again. Thank you. I'll pick on James.
Thank you. Well, one thing about this format is you're always on your toes because you never know the day nor the hour when you will be called upon to speak. It is a privilege to be part of this discussion. It is somewhat intimidating as I come from a slightly different discipline to hear such brilliant perspectives and reflections on the topic at hand. Maybe to pick a slightly different entry point, maybe building on your challenge to the professions. I'll center on the moment that we're currently in. You know, I started 2020 really focused, as I have been over the last 2 or 3 years with a subset of my colleagues, on the question of youth livelihoods in Africa and this big challenge of creating well over 100 million jobs or or dignified livelihoods over the next decade if we were to avoid a real societal breakdown, arguably one that we were seeing in varying ways. And in that work, asking, how do we prepare people for the workforce? How do we create new jobs? What are the jobs of the future? The forces of mechanization, automation, and other things are all working together. And the legacies of colonialism, apartheid, and so on, acting on young people across the continent, particularly young women. It became clear that, one of the things one needed to understand were digital platforms, or platforms more generally that the next generation were already using to navigate what the system that they found, the spatial arrangements that they were in, the built environment that they were in, and what form were those platforms already taking, and what form might they take in the future. And starting to ask the question, digital jobs or digitally mediated access to jobs or opportunities as a major area of thought. And then came February and March. And all of a sudden we were on this new planet that we've all been migrated to, that we call home, which is COVID land. In which, a couple of things. In the first instance was that rush to respond or prepare, and in that, actually bringing that platform thinking very much to life and forcing ourselves to move quickly, while then subsequently reflecting deeply. Out of that came, one example of an action that really ties this stuff together was a platform called Safe Hands Kenya, where we basically took a lot of the digital, platform businesses that were starting to take shape, that often stood as a bridge between the formal and the informal sector, and using them as a bridge to roll out at scale water and sanitation, messages on masking, and so on and so forth, into the informal settlements of the city of Nairobi. There's a whole set of narratives there about the fact that social distancing was just not realistic, given the way that the African city, certainly the African city I live in, had evolved. And so how do you call together business, social sector actors in the various informal settlements, and tradespeople, so not just the big business but the small ones, into a sort of alliance. And the interesting thing was, faced with an existential challenge, what we all understood to be an existential challenge, a lot of issues around things like, where will the margin come from? Can we change our model quick? A lot of these things fell away. And you were able to actually see enterprises say, for the social good, I am willing to deliver my wares, be that soap, be that transportation of soap, be that media exposure. I am willing to deliver those things at cost, in a way that substantially reduces the cost of delivery and substantially increases reach. And we saw the way that, by using digital platforms, suddenly you were able to bridge into the informal world where 85% of most African populations reside, using the platforms and the tools that they were using to connect at scale. So that's one aspect of this, an interesting showcase of the fact that when put under pressure, the system throws up certain solutions to deal with where we are today. But I think the bigger issue for me coming out of this is what do we do with the big reset that is this this pandemic? The forced digitalization is one part of this. We're not having this conversation in person. So many other shifts that we thought would take a long time, would probably take 4 or 5 years, have happened in 4 or 5 months in the way that we work and engage with each other. What does that mean for the future of cities, for the future of livelihoods in particular, and dignified livelihoods within cities, is an important question. But I think other aspects of the way that African cities, African countries work have also been fundamentally shaken. I think underpinning in some way some of the shakiness we're seeing in some of our countries is we just saw the death knell of the petrostate rung in the last few months. What does that mean for the legitimacy of governments that do not rule by the consent of the governed, but by extracted profits from natural resources, if indeed the end of big oil is in sight? And all of that then begs a very simple question, which is, we've hit this big reset. So many assumptions on the way we structured our countries, our economies, and so on have been shaken. And we now need to design a way forward. And frankly, the absence of a design is a design in itself. And it's not just about the built environment, it's about our economic arrangements, it's about our social arrangements, it's about the skills and investments that we make. And I think that is the point at which we find ourselves, where the environment and environmental sustainability has to be central. The real needs of the next generation have to be key. And frankly, the excuse of the past, which is there were all these empowered incumbents standing in the way of fundamental change, might not necessarily stand, because one of the things the reset has done is really shake a whole range of incumbents across industries, geographies, and sectors. So it's a moment of opportunity, and it's one that I'm curious and keen to hear from design thinkers on. How do we really build on and from, and how do we bring that proactive design thinking to a wider array of disciplines as well? So with that, maybe I'll throw the ball to you, Charles.
Thank you very much, James. Let me just, thank you very much, James. And thank you for Platform 100 opportunity to actually invite me to speak. Mine is not really a lot to say about, and given the space that I am in at the moment as the president of SACEP, and I have a lot of interaction with the government, and the government, as you know, is busy with the plans to roll out infrastructure, which will help the economy recovery in South Africa. What really is of essence is the basis on which that infrastructure is based on, what triggers the choice of that kind of infrastructure, what informs those choices. And it makes me ask questions on the areas that I'm interested in, which is that of the people, the empowering of the people. Who are we trying to save, with this infrastructure? Really, what at the center of whatever we do is the people, and that is, for me, very essential in whatever we do. Which brings me to the question of the urban performances in our cities. That has, I think everyone knows that our urban areas are not as performing as they're supposed to be. And the question one wants to ask is, how do we turn those urban areas that are not performing through design to make them perform? And what sort of framework can we put in place and probably recommend to our government to say that we have the problems in this area, and then we have problems of urban sprawl. How do we arrest the urban sprawl? How do we use this opportunity that we have to actually map a way forward as to what kind of a society should we be in South Africa and in the world as a whole, because our problems are not really isolated from the rest of the world. The values that we are longing for, in our country, in terms of a society, what kind of society do you want to be, and how should we use design, and infrastructure and urban form to actually enhance those values that we want to be as a society. We want to have, society which has equity, equal access to opportunities, society which embraces diversity, and diversity actually, like most of the scholars agree that diversity is at the center of the resilient cities, which are now not in existence at the moment. We need to really look forward to the cities that are resilient and the urban areas that are resilient, that can only be achieved in collaboration with the people that are actually ignored, those people that are actually have taken it upon themselves to in informal settlements to create nothing out of nothing, something out of nothing, and I think we have a lot to learn from those people, and you know, interrelations between ourselves as the built environment professionals, you know, in collaboration with the people on the ground, in collaboration with the policymakers. And I think if we can look into really empowering the civic spaces, looking at the empowering civic spaces by making sure that whatever we put, you know, on the table as a framework, a design framework, where it enhances the cities that will perform in the future. You know, at the moment, we know we've been complaining about the cities that are not doing well, the cities that are not inclusive, the cities that are exclusionary, the cities that are not empowering our people. And then the opportunity we have now is to actually use this platform to actually inform, you know, those design theories and probably come up with suggestions that can actually inform the ideas government has and probably enriches what government is planning to do at the moment, which is lacking in terms of knowing, identifying the users, the people who are supposed to be benefiting, which is dealing with the issues of the informality and formality. So for me, I am very much interested in the resilient cities for the future, which are actually doing away with the current situation or the current urban that is not performing at the moment. I would like to stop it. And then the next person, maybe that I should.
I think it's Prof. Mpofu who's actually last. Yes. Last but not least. Thank you so much for that, Charles. Thank you. Prof?
Thank you very much, Ndugu, and the rest of the colleagues. Can you hear me clearly?
We can. You're slightly in the dark, but you know what? Your voice is more important. So go ahead.
You just never know, you know. Is it better now?
Somewhat better. Somewhat better. Please proceed. Looking forward to hearing from you. Yes.
So thank you to Prof. Osman for being so kind and gracious to invite me to come and be the wolf among the lambs. You know, the language that I am talking is less architectural, but more about connecting people with places, like I said when we had our initial meeting to the other colleagues. So design, civic culture, and empowerment. I think as an engineer, you know, the only part that frightens you there is the part that says civic culture. But the reality is that if you really think about it, even as you design, whether it's designing machines or you're designing technologies for the fourth industrial revolution, at the end of the day, it comes back to issues of influencing the culture of where people need to live and the efficiency of the cities that they live in, but also the beauty as well, which is a very important aspect. So from the work that we are doing, our work is focusing on assisting, facilitating mobility by looking at the manufacturing problems that are associated with moving from one place to the next. I think with all of us, our lives, one of the most important things that happens in our lives is this aspect of moving from one place to the next, whether I'm flying overseas or I'm cycling to a neighbor, or I'm catching a lift from a friend to work. Our lives are centered around connecting with places. And for me, the question of how are we utilizing these opportunities to solve the spatial challenges that people find themselves faced with because of the previous apartheid regime, specifically here in South Africa, on how to connect people who are very far away from the places of work and also from the places of worthwhile learning. So how, while solving those challenges, how do we create economic opportunities, not just for the people maybe who can design modes of transport, but also for the people who can utilize those designed aspects to provide opportunities for young people, for people who are without work, to have opportunities to work even in the context where they are finding themselves in. We currently have a project that we are focusing on that has been shortlisted for the UNESCO Newton Africa Prize Award, that is focused on developing a last mile mobility solution for people in vulnerable communities. And you will agree with me that the reality is that most of the times when we come up with design ideas, we forget the most vulnerable in our society. And for me, this preparation of this project gave me the opportunity to reflect in a very serious way about when we design things, starting at the other side of the value chain, where the resources are few, maybe is a very good way of thinking about the things that we do. Because if it can be customized for people who are challenged and struggling with resources, then for the people who have enough resources and they've got a little extra for this and that, then you can always be able to modify and add all the interesting things of life. Last Friday, we also had an opportunity to go and see the possibilities with plastic. And I think from an architectural perspective, there are conversations that I need to have there with my colleague, Prof. Osman, because there's so much that can be done with plastic. And the interesting thing for me is that the organization was saying that they are willing to train anybody to work on plastic, whether it's about architecture or it's about just beautifying spaces, or it's even about making mobility mechanisms, connecting people with places. So I think for me, the issue of economic growth, climate change, and poverty alleviation is a very key aspect that needs to be addressed going forward in designing the civic cultural matters, and also empowering the societies that we find ourselves in. And interestingly, of late, several colleagues have been coming to me and saying, with the ideas you have, how can we as people who design spaces tap into the way of your thinking? And I hope I will have more conversations coming out of this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, colleagues. I think that's a wonderful segue in terms of the next part of our conversation, but also connecting it to the broader theme of why we have such a diverse set of actors or players in this conversation. For the benefit of those of you who've just joined, I'm just going to do a quick summary of what are the sort of key points which have come out of the conversation. And then we're going to have a much more open dialogue on some of the common themes that have emerged out of today's conversation. Ntato provoked us with this question of the importance of public space and digitization, and understanding the role of youth and taking inspiration through and beyond architecture. Kieran spoke about a richer way of practice, the importance of empowerment, understanding how to engage with government. And I liked your particular use of the phrase fragments, which is this very powerful idea about bringing disparate pieces or actors together into more cohesive conversations. Magda, I think your words on how do you engage with the margins of the disenfranchised, unpacking this question of informality versus formality, which actually reminds me, if you will, of some of the conversations we had back in Cairo. And this unique term, juxtapolis pedagogy, is something I also hope that we'll be able to unpack in today's discussion, and understanding what does spectrum thinking mean, and for those of us who are in the design space and beyond the design space. One of the things that I always observe in these sort of sessions is that there's always a different pedagogy or a discipline or a sort of language, if you will, that underpins how we begin to think of these issues. But once you scrape away the sort of taxonomy or the definitions as per discipline, there's really a common ground for understanding and action. And to that point, Magda, you landed something that's actually very close to my heart when you spoke about the question of ethics, and that good design is a basic human right. It actually reminds me of a talk I gave at GSAP maybe 5-6 years ago around this question of really reframing human rights and access to quality design as not a privilege, but as something that's fundamental to who we are. And you also made the very important point, Magda, about the importance of agency of bodies and bodies in relation to space. Mabel, I loved your provocation. I think your critique of these sort of binary definitions, which have continued to reinforce themselves both in academia, in the professional space, and how we imagine cities, I think is particularly pertinent. I think also locating your conversation with regards to the impact of racial capitalism, how this reproduces other forms of inequity is key. And you also picked up on the importance of public space. And what does that mean, and how do we articulate that? Tao, I think your provocation around the centralization, if you will, of the gaze, if that's one way of looking at the gaze of, let's say, the designer as seeing themselves as central to the sort of discourse, and your recognition of that sort of dissonance that comes out of that condition is something that's very, very useful. You used the phrase, how do we work? And I think that's one of the most powerful interventions of your contribution, because by talking about we, it becomes far much broader than just about designers, but it becomes far much more inclusive. It becomes far much more engaged. And I think us being aware of that sort of dissonance is key to our sensitivity towards the issues that we face. James, your provocation about dignified livelihoods, but also this question of contingency, being able to react to different circumstances, whether they might be at the sort of macro pandemic scale or down to the scale of the neighborhood, where through Safe Hands Kenya, there is this sort of opportunity, if you will, we are able to unlock the talents of people on the ground to make cities better, I think speaks to a very interesting granular approach that could allow us to solve some of the bigger problems that we have out there. And yes, I think in light of the Great Reset, a phrase which is commonplace in many, many circles, and finding different sorts of expressions, build back better, etc. I liked your provocation when you said, what does it mean in terms of economic arrangements, opportunity, and what does it mean for people, countries, or macroeconomic approaches such as the petro state? Charles, your observation about the importance of empowering people resonates with a lot of what everybody has said. And your key question, I think, which is who is being served by these sort of infrastructures, is something that is radically important, particularly where, in terms of the continent, sometimes the connection between infrastructure, political patronage, sometimes has asymmetric impacts in terms of how these resources are given back to people. And I think your consistent beating that drum, if you will, in terms of understanding who are the people and what is the role of government, is something that would be important, not just for designers, but for political actors too. Obviously, hopefully, to unlock this question of resilient cities. And last but not least, Prof. Mpofu, your assertion about connecting people to place also sits very well in terms of this conversation. And I particularly like the fact that, yes, you are a designer, maybe not an architect, but that's immaterial, frankly speaking. I think what is important is that you are a critical voice in terms of connecting innovation and technology to addressing some of the spatial challenges that we face out there. So having said that, and trying to really try and amalgamate these amazing contributions, some key themes have emerged out of this morning's discussion. One is this question of empowerment, and what does that look like? Obviously, it ties back to the broader theme, but each one of you have spoken in a very particular way about being granular, about being user-centric focused, about understanding who will be the beneficiaries of these sorts of design strategies. And also, I think, to an extent, being aware of who gets left out of these conversations. I think, Mabel, your intervention was particularly useful in terms of highlighting how these supposed infrastructures, whether they be social, economic, etc., can sometimes intentionally or unintentionally produce other adjacencies which are problematic, and we need to be aware of that. So where to now? We have about a half hour or so to try and thread together some of these very rich ideas, which obviously we cannot capture just now, but this will be part of a series of discussions. I would like to point to Ntato, just because you started first and probably the audience hasn't heard from you compared to others, on this question of the divided city, empowerment and agency. and whether, you know, ethnicity or identity is a useful entry point to understanding cities. And this could be whether it's, you know, sexual orientation, it could be according to race, it could be according to class groups. I know you've done some very, one of your earliest works actually was quite provocative in terms of informing the provincial government of the Western Cape in terms of how economic strategy could be far much more inclusive. So you've been at this coalface of understanding communities and access and to an extent public space. What are your reflections right now, and what are the sort of things that you think we need to take with us if we, and can we use these categories to rethink how we deploy resources for people?
Well, I think that notions, the notion that civic cultures are suited to some cultures and that economic development produces cultural changes, such as civic culture, is questionable. I think there's an existing body of knowledge that doesn't recognize that Africa has a long-standing history in civic culture. And perhaps we should be reflecting on how public space and design aids the formation of identities in a context of social engineering where contested heritage, polarized nationalism, broad identities and counter-identities, as well as racially, generationally, gendered, and locationally determined socioeconomic inequality prevails. And again, I'll pull back to the digital space. So maybe something can be learned from digital space and media, from the journeys that have been taken by an SABC or Netflix, right? So SABC started off framing, if you recall, when we came into the so-called Rainbow Nation, we framed national identity through SABC as a Rainbow Nation. And then it went on to Simunye, which is We Are One. And then eventually it went on to Yamampela, which was Keeping It Real. And at that stage, it revealed society's unwillingness and unreadiness to confront the reality. And if you recall, that's when they released that ad around race reversal. And I think what I'm trying to get to here is this issue around these issues around identity and identity construction and so on and so forth. Then you can look at Netflix and see that Netflix is not an identity-driven company. It's a data-driven company. And what it does is it tailors their unique experiences to the people who experience it. And then those people find common spaces to find their tribe. So maybe lessons from the Internet of Things and social media teaches us how not to create civil cultures in a context of divided identities, where, for instance, and you've seen with the social media, there's unintended consequences and huge social political risks that arise from commodifying identity in an attempt to direct behaviors and civic culture through targeted content and meaning. And I'm using this within the context of design as a means of directing behaviors and civic cultures through targeted content and meaning in how we design spaces. So what resonates with me really is understanding how different groups occupy and use and bring unifying meaning to space. And then how then does that translate into the design world? I struggle with this issue of identity, Mokena, because I think some of the other speakers have spoken about vulnerability and contestation. And you know, as a young Black African woman, I sit in that intersectional space, which is considered to some extent part of the bottom of the food chain. So I struggle with this issue of identity and how identities get mediated through space, how agency around identity is accommodated through design. But my view and the lessons that I draw from the digital world, social media, etc., is perhaps understanding how different identities use space and how those tensions can be mediated in space. Keeping in mind that the mediation through design, perhaps if I can put it, the mediation through design has to accommodate issues of power, issues of agency, issues of economics, and whether or not design, if you're calling it a human right, whether or not design is actually able to be that instrument that can transfer value from those who are historically empowered through space to those who are on the margin and excluded from space.
Perfect, perfect.
I'll
I've
leave
got
it
a
there.
question. That's perfect contribution. I've got a question or comment from Kieran. Yeah, the floor is yours, Kieran.
Yeah, thanks, McKenna. I suppose maybe if I could follow Nataro's comment, really, because in a way, for the period of the conflict in Belfast, for almost 30 years, probably or thereabouts, most inner city residents didn't access the city centre or the city core other than for shopping, or for those who happened to work in the place, and then they left at 5:30 or 6 o'clock to go back home again. And what happened effectively for that period was that many citizens didn't see themselves as having any particular identity to the city per se as one city. And once the opportunity of the Good Friday Agreement in 1998 came to the fore, and there was a period of euphoria where citizens and others felt that they could more easily engage with government and begin to plan a better future together and build for a one city with probably an ambition that wasn't declared so that they would leave no one behind effectively. And those initial conversations between city administration and inner city neighbourhoods was to ask them the question why they neglected to contact with the city centre, other than asking themselves the question, of course, why didn't they actually reach out and engage? And part of the difficulty was that for some parts of the city, because there was a belief that they were more directly aligned with political influences or identities or even religious identities, that many people felt that they didn't want to be part of the city centre, they didn't want to be part of one city. And also that was layered with problems where people were seen to be either barbaric or because they had a particular political allegiance, that they were therefore not one of us and all that kind of stuff. What has happened though, and it's taken a long time for it to happen in Belfast, which is a very small city. I mean, Belfast population is only 300,000 people or thereabouts. It has taken a long time, and the opportunity has come about through a piece of infrastructure. That is, there's a bus that now goes from the outer west part of the city through the city centre to the east part of the city that connects communities that were once in conflict with each other, that were once diametrically opposed, and now feel there's a better way to connect and a better way to reach out and share their experience, because each of them have rich experience to share in terms of how they build neighbourhoods, what neighbourhood means, what livelihood and home might mean for ordinary people. So I think it is a slow process, but it'll take its time to get there. But I think we will all get there, certainly in our small town.
That's fantastic, and I'd like to build on what you're saying, and also what Ntato's response is in terms of being perhaps critical about these sort of categories of identity, by pointing to Magda. Magda, I remember when we had some of our chats in Cairo, and particularly looking at Cairenes and this question of informal versus formal, and like who has a sense of a right to the city was one of the subtexts of our conversation, because it's all good to talk about human rights, it's all good to talk about empowerment, but if citizens or perhaps don't feel that they are citizens of a city because they're seen to be informal, they're seen to be on the margins, I think it's important for us to unpack whether these sort of identity fissures, if you will, what does that speak to for us as designers, as policymakers, as decision makers, in terms of ensuring that people have access to equitable resources. I'm not sure, Magda, if you follow me. I'm just trying to connect this point of about citizenship, disenfranchisement, and this notion, partly provoked by Kieran, about the city being an other place, as well as Ntato's likewise provocation about identity. To what extent has identity been useful or not useful in terms of your understanding of urbanization, Magda?
I think there are 2 points here, Mokena, and thank you for the question. I think the first point is for us to really take a very critical look at who we mean when we say the word all, when we say design for all, or when we say inclusion of all, or when we say participation of all. Who are we really talking about? Because invariably in design conversations, when you say all or you say everyone, we are still very much dominated by the normative white male model, that Le Corbusian modular model. and that permeates almost all design acts and design practice, who we really are engaging with and who we are designing for. So it's stretching that description of the user and who we mean when we say user. And not to be afraid. I think there's a lot of fear of participatory design in a very true, authentic sense, because the more disenfranchised the margins are, the louder their voice will be when they come to participate, because and the only solution isn't more and so that's the first thought. The second thought also is to redefine our role as architects, to not only practice but teach our future architects that an architect is not only about form making, and an architect is not only about construction and building, but to know that the role of architecture is just as important pre that form making stage and post that form making stage. And sometimes form making may not even be part of a truly authentic, valuable architectural process, that it may not, it may be about not building anything at all. The choice not to build may be as important a decision to make as the choice of what ourselves as, and that's part of this Juxtapolis pedagogy, to redefine what the role of a future architect should be. A moderator, a negotiator, a convener of conversation, a curator of ideas. I think conversations like this is architecture. These types of conversations and defining and finding through lines is just as valuable as creating an object, because without these conversations, that object may end up not being what it needs to be. So those two thoughts, this idea of expanding who we mean when we say all, and when we say inclusion of whom, and make sure that that stretches as far as possible across the human condition as possible, but also redefining what role architects can play and what architecture can act.
That's fantastic. That's fantastic. I see Tao has his hand up. And Tata, you also have your hand up, but I'd like to make sure that the panel also just try and build in some equity. So maybe Tao first, and then I'll pick somebody else from the panel. Tao, over to you, sir.
Cheers, McKenna. I was just really just thinking, Magda, and you are in agreement, said before that good design is a human right. And listening to Ntato, she's talking about identity and how that's a very confused sort of like space to try to navigate. It occurs to me that, you know, good is a very subjective, and to say good design is a human right, perhaps somehow goes into this question of identity, because who's defining what's good? Seeing that there's just been this conversation right now about how sort of the normative, you know, person in power is a very particular identity. It then sort of, for me, begs the question, you know, I just want to point out, I suppose how loaded the good design is a good, it sounds great. I'll wear that t-shirt. But at the same time, I think it brings together a whole bunch of questions around, you know, these dimensions, which I think are very, very important too. Are we talking about aesthetics? Are we talking about, as Magda hinted now, that sometimes good design is actually not designing anything. It's you know, so I think that's something worth unpacking. I would particularly like to hear what Mabel has to say about this, because I know some of the work that you have done with communities and whatever, that sort of like is at the interface of all these things, I suppose on some level goes past and beyond just the aesthetics and tries to find a very different way to engage with these questions. Thanks, McKenna.
Great. No, wonderful provocation. And that's exactly why it's such a good phrase, because it forces us to question the sort of tropes behind what is good, what is design, what is basic, what is human, and what is a right. In sequence, I'd like, I'm glad that you pointed out Mabel, but actually James's hand was up first. So James, Mabel, and then Ntato, in that order, please.
Thanks, Mokena. I just wanted to pick up on something that Kieran said, and just in this area of the Great Reset, and the historical role of the CBD as where people went in to do their work and then go home. And it strikes me that a major question that we will all need to navigate across the world of design, business, policy, etc., is the reality that for many white collar professions, it is unlikely that we're going to go back to the CBD or the idea of a CBD in exactly the way that it existed even 9 months ago, fully, right? I know from other conversations, a lot of companies are looking at cutting down office space massively. What does that mean once that whole notion of every day, a good chunk of the urban population goes to a central space, does their work either directly in certain professions or in the service economy that's built up around this commuting, and then goes back to their homes? What happens when that's gone, or when you don't have to build that up anyway? If you're designing these new urban, African urban approaches, how might those be shaped by the fact that the African city is going to largely evolve in a period post the traditional kind of clerical CBD? And I think that to me is one of those big questions whose overall impact on even what we think of as being the city will only become clearer over in time and in hindsight, but behooves us to think about proactively now.
Wonderful, wonderful intersection. Mabel, the floor is yours.
Great, no, thank you. I mean, these are really great comments, and I wanted to maybe link a little bit of what Nthato was saying, and also Kieran, because I find your example of Belfast fascinating about literally how the city was divided, but it was also divided by design, right? And this historical situation in Ireland is the result of 400, 500 years, right, of English presence that created the conditions, right, of division. In my recent research, it was fascinating to understand that the idea of the plantation actually had to do with the English come into Ireland and literally planting themselves, enclosing land, right, and throwing Irish off, and also just racializing them as other, right? So this process of identity formation is an old one, and it's important to recognize that often comes with this idea of difference, is also putting into place value, right? Who is more valuable than others? And that becomes a political, an economic, a social, a cultural. And it's complicated because all of those things are working together to produce range, right, of who has resources and opportunities and who doesn't. And so, it's a very complicated historical process in terms of like how we end up where we are. But the other thing I wanted to talk about or mention was what Magda was talking about design process, and having worked on a very complicated design for a memorial at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville. It was important for us because the university's relationship with the Black community was a contentious one. And, they didn't quite know how to reach out. And so actually going out as designers and first listening to why people, what people had to say, but also understanding why they may not want to talk to us was very important for how we designed, and opening up a dialogue was critical. So in the end, they had an investment literally in the project itself and started to tell the university what it could and couldn't do. And that was something new. But I think, these sort of dialogues, which you could call community design based, are critical, but I don't necessarily think you have to sacrifice design or what is so-called good design necessarily in those processes.
Absolutely. Nthato, I think you had your hand up. Do you still want to make?
Yeah, I wanted to go back to the point that I think Magda made about agencies and bodies in space, as well as this point Mabel has raised previously about the rights of non-citizens. And perhaps there's space in current thinking around well-being. And I think I was enlightened, Magda, when you spoke about the sensorial experience in the city. And so the question becomes whether designers are able to mitigate, enable the sensorial experience of non-citizens within cities, within public space, within design, where it has already been designed to violate their sense of well-being. I'm specifically raising this because when we speak about race or gender or generation or level of disability or sexual orientation, I mean, there's so many categories of non-citizenship. I think often the assumption is that you can lump it all into one, but there's a lot of intersectionality there. But is there a readiness of the design profession to actually consider that level of intersectionality in design? I'll bring it right back to my initial comment when I spoke to that race reversal ad that is one of the few ads banned in South Africa because it made the entire community, the entire nation confront the reality of Blackness through a white lens. And no one was ready for it. It's still banned to this day. And so how then, as the design profession or as architects, urban planners, built environment professions, do we confront the discomfort around intersectionality, the discomfort of non-citizenship in how we design so that these so-called non-citizens can experience well-being within the built environment?
That's fantastic. And you know what, we could talk for at least another hour. And I haven't even given the platform for Amira to be a participant, although of course I need to hand over to her to close off this event. Let me start by saying that it has been a fascinating discussion, entirely fruitful. I think some very powerful common themes have come through: agency, design, empowerment, understanding the margins, citizenship, livability, lovable cities. I cannot thank you enough for your contribution. Also, thank you to the audience. And I hope that this will be one of many conversations where we can begin to redefine and reframe and recalibrate, if you will, our understanding of urbanization, its causes, its effects, and how do we make better cities for all and better ecological environments. And with that, I'd like to hand over to Amira.
My mic was off. Thank you so much. That was fascinating. And I'm reading the comments on the chat. Nothing is going to be lost. I just want to reassure everyone, this is really the start of a conversation. So much has come out of this, and debates that definitely need to continue. I mean, I have here design as essential or as a basic human right, and design can't solve all problems. And we need another hour to have a conversation around that. But also issues around identity and who we are. And Tato's asking, which designers are we talking about, and gives us a whole range of other examples. So there's also so much to unpack there. Can't remember who said it, was it Majda, but I think it was Majda about not building. I wrote in 2004 in my PhD that the decision not to build is an architectural decision, and I stand by that, my quote. You know, so there's so much that needs to be. So is architecture actually in the building, or is it sometimes not in the building? And I did in my opening statement speak quite strongly about this focus on the object building, which we celebrate and reward, and forgetting all other things. So there's so much that we still need to talk about, and we will. I want to make like to strongly, again, center design. And I'll tell you why, Tao, and we can have many conversations around this. The condition we are in now has been carefully designed. We are in it. We need to fix it, undo it. And you know, if you have any other tools, then we will discuss that. But I think design is so central. But I mean, this issue of what that Ntatu asks, which designers, this needs to be a collaborative thing. So it's not like, oh, architecture is like the key profession that needs to now guide everything else. No, that's not the way we're thinking about it. Just design. Things need to be fixed through design. And, you know, I look at these examples that Kieran is giving in a divided city and this bus connected connecting these sections of the city. And I think about things in South Africa here, about decisions around routes or where to position certain services and how that is used systematically to disadvantage so many years after democracy. And that we have to fix this through design. I really believe that, but I'm not, Tao, I really want you to notice, I'm not saying architecture, it's through design. The architectural profession and other design professions being really important in it. One of the things that bothers me, and I'm just going to leave it, you know, again, it needs a longer session to unpack it, is during apartheid, there was a certain value system, certain political intentions, and things were designed very systematically, carefully, in a particular way to disadvantage certain people. And now post-apartheid, we seem to be denying that level of professional service to communities to get them out of that situation. Yeah. Now we go and sit with people in informal settlements and let's do a bit of reblocking and open up the roads and, you know, fix your shack. And I am incredibly bothered by that because I feel like we're denying. Now that leads us into the whole issue around expertise and power and the professions. And yes, so when I talk about we need to find different ways to participate or to encourage participation, I think it's a lot more complex than let's go and ask the community what they want. And I really do worry that sometimes we deny essential professional services to the communities that need it the most. So I have no doubt that every one of you will want to respond to this, but this is the first of many conversations. So please, you know, Geshe and a number of other people, I'm seeing your comments in the chat. This is an ongoing conversation, and please do not feel like, you know, now you're not getting a chance to respond. You will. And we will engage with our audience as well, and we will take this forward. So I hope that kind of it's just me sharing what's emerged and what my concerns are. And I think we can conclude it there if everyone is in agreement.
Well, let's say that the meeting will end, but the conversation will not be concluded. We will need to clarify. Thank you, everybody, for coming through. Yeah.
I actually just want to conclude. Okay, so Geshe, I see you wrote a comment there, and I actually wanted to see if you just wanted to say bye to everyone on a note.
No, not really. It's not my show today. So thank you, everybody. I think it's an exciting start, lots to debate, and probably the debate that needs to be had. So really excited to have Platform 100 offering that space. So well done. Thank you.
All the best. Have a wonderful day, everybody.
Thank you to each and everyone. Really appreciate it.
Take care.
Thank you all.
There's so much to talk about, and we will do so.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
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 Thank you. Bye-bye.